Once upon a time, there was a poor miller who had 3 sons. When the miller died, he left each of his sons something. The oldest son received the mill, the second son got a donkey, and the youngest son, much to his disappointment, only inherited a cat. The youngest son was sad and thought, "What can I do with just a cat? I'll surely starve to death." But the cat, who overheard his master's thoughts, surprised him by speaking. "Don't be sad, master," said the cat. "Give me a bag and a pair of boots, and you'll see that I am worth much more than you think." Though the young man was doubtful, he gave the cat what he asked for, a small sack and a pair of boots. The cat put on the boots, slung the bag over his shoulder, and went out into the fields. Puss in Boots caught a fat rabbit by laying a clever trap with the bag. Then, he went to the king's palace and offered the rabbit as a gift, saying it was from his master, the Marquis of Carabas. The king was very pleased with the gift, and Puss in Boots continued bringing more game, such as partridges, over the next few weeks. Each time, he told the king that it was from his master, the Marquis of Carabas, though, of course, the young man wasn't really a marquis at all. One day, Puss in Boots heard that the king was going to take a ride along the river with his daughter, the princess. Puss immediately ran back to his master and said, "If you do as I say, your fortune will be made. Go to the river and bathe, and leave the rest to me." The young man trusted the clever cat and went to the river to bathe, just as Puss had instructed. While he was in the water, the king's carriage approached. Just as it did, Puss in Boots started shouting, "Help! Help! My master, the Marquis of Carabas, is drowning!" The king, hearing the cries for help, stopped the carriage and looked out. Recognizing the cat as the one who had been bringing him gifts, the king quickly ordered his guards to rescue the young man from the water. When the young man was pulled from the river, he was, of course, completely naked, for Puss had hidden his master's clothes in some bushes. "Oh no!" cried Puss. "My master's fine clothes have been stolen by some thieves while he was bathing." The king immediately ordered one of his servants to fetch rich clothing for the Marquis of Carabas. Soon, the young man was dressed in beautiful, expensive clothes and looked quite like a nobleman. The king, impressed by his appearance, invited him to ride in the royal carriage with him and the princess. As they rode together, the princess grew quite fond of the handsome young man. She found him kind and charming, and before long, she began to smile at him and speak with him sweetly. The young man was shy but grateful for the cat's cleverness that had brought him this opportunity. Meanwhile, Puss in Boots ran ahead of the carriage. He came to some fields where peasants were working and said to them, "If the king passes by and asks who owns these fields, you must tell him that they belong to the Marquis of Carabas. If you don't, you'll be chopped into little pieces." The peasants, terrified of the cat's threats, agreed. As the king's carriage passed by the fields, he admired the rich, beautiful land. "Who owns these fields?" the king asked the peasants. The frightened workers, remembering Puss in Boots' warning, all answered, "These fields belong to the Marquis of Carabas, Your Majesty." The king was impressed by how much land the young man seemed to own, and turned to him, saying, "You have a grand estate, Marquis." The young man, unsure of what to say, just smiled and nodded, while Puss in Boots continued to run ahead. Soon, Puss came to a large meadow where more workers were cutting grass. Again, he told them, "If the king asks who owns these meadows, you must say they belong to the Marquis of Carabas, or you will be chopped into pieces." When the king's carriage arrived, the king asked, "And who owns these meadows?" The workers, afraid of Puss, answered, "The Marquis of Carabas, Your Majesty." The king was even more impressed by this young marquis, who seemed to own so much land. Puss in Boots continued to run ahead until he reached a grand castle. This castle belonged to a rich and powerful ogre who ruled over all the land that Puss had claimed for his master. The ogre was feared by everyone because he was not only wealthy, but also had the ability to transform into any creature he wished. Puss in Boots, without fear, went up to the castle and knocked on the door. The ogre, curious to see who was bold enough to visit him, opened the door and invited Puss inside. Once inside the grand castle, Puss in Boots greeted the ogre with great respect and said, "I have heard many wonderful things about your magical powers. It is said that you can transform yourself into any creature you like, a lion, for example. Is that true?" The ogre, proud of his abilities, replied, "Indeed, it is true. Watch me." And with that, the ogre transformed into a huge roaring lion, his sharp teeth and mighty paws on full display. Puss pretended to be frightened and exclaimed, "How impressive! But surely a great magician like you could also transform into something small, like a mouse." The ogre, wanting to prove how powerful he truly was, scoffed and said, "Of course I can." And with a snap of his fingers, the ogre shrank down and turned into a tiny mouse. In that instant, Puss in Boots pounced on the mouse and gobbled him up in one quick bite. The ogre was gone for good. With the ogre out of the way, Puss in Boots took control of the castle. When the king's carriage arrived, Puss greeted him at the gate and said, "Welcome to the castle of my master, the Marquis of Carabas." The king was amazed by the splendid castle, the grand halls, and the beautiful gardens. He turned to the young man and said, "Marquis, you truly are a wealthy and fortunate man. I would be most happy to have you marry my daughter." The young man, who had already fallen in love with the princess, gladly accepted the king's offer. The princess, too, was delighted, for she had grown very fond of the kind and handsome young man. A grand wedding was held, and the young man married the princess. Puss in Boots was made a great lord and lived in the castle with his master. He never had to chase mice again, and instead spent his days in comfort and luxury. And so, thanks to the cleverness of Puss in Boots, the young man lived happily ever after, enjoying wealth, love, and the favor of the king.